and we are together virtually tonight for our third community forum with our third and final Superintendent of Schools finalist, Dr. Julie Kukenberger. Dr. Kukenberger is currently serving as the interim superintendent of the Hamilton-Wenham Regional School District. She previously served as the superintendent of schools in Scarborough, Maine, and in leadership positions in Maine, New Jersey, and in Haverhill, Massachusetts. She was a classroom teacher at the elementary level as well in a public school system on McGuire Air Force Base. We're very, very happy to have her with us tonight. Just to remind everyone that we are all practicing social distancing at this time, and so we are running this forum virtually once again. You can submit questions for Dr. Kukenberger on at the URL that's listed at the bottom of the screen, and I will be asking her these questions throughout our time together tonight. I would just remind everyone that what we try to do is get through one question from each person before we circle back to people's second or third questions, but you can, of course, submit those as you will. And also, I do try to consolidate questions or summarize them if more than one person is asking the same thing. As always, we appreciate your patience and good humor with this process, and we welcome Dr. Kukenberger. I think I'll start off with a general question that came in from multiple parents, which is, why do you want to be superintendent of the Melrose Public Schools?
Great question. So thank you for having me here tonight. I appreciate everyone who's engaging from afar so that we can all stay healthy and safe during this COVID-19 response. So why Melrose Public Schools for me? I am amazed and impressed by the good work that is happening in the district. From everything I can tell through my research of reading the website, reading different press releases, and also looking at some of the big state level data, you are serving students very well in a lot of ways. You are on the forefront of many educational trends that are grounded in really specific evidence, such as competency-based learning, personalized learning, and really looking at how do we ensure that we're meeting the needs of all students with varying backgrounds. So that's all work that I'm passionate about and really excited to learn more about your district and how that looks day to day. And I also believe that my varied experience as a classroom teacher, a vice principal, a principal, a director of curriculum, an assistant superintendent in an urban district, and my experience as a superintendent can add value to that work and help the district maintain momentum during this very big transition that you're about to experience. Having done that in a couple of districts across 3 different states, I think I also bring a unique lens that really understands the pressure points at each level and knows what it takes to implement transformational change, and while also maintaining what the district values and cares about most.
Wonderful, thank you. Our first question comes from Molly Babb, who is an elementary school parent here in Melrose, and she asks, what are the tactics and best practices you have used to communicate effectively with parents and community members in your career?
Hi, Molly. Thanks for your question. So over time, my communication style has evolved as I learn more as a leader, but also as I try to adapt based on what each community that I'm serving prefers. So I think one of the things in my entry process will be really learning and understanding how do people in Melrose like to receive their information? Is this a community that relies on social media? Is there a local paper that folks rely on? Do you prefer direct emails right from the school department, face-to-face conversations, two-way dialogue, or something that I'm not yet thinking of? I think it really needs to be tailored to where the community currently is, and making sure that we're engaging a wide range of stakeholders as we're working to tell our story to the best of our ability. So some specific examples I could give would be in my past district, parents were very active on social media. That was the place where a lot of folks were getting their information, but yet some of our community members really relied on the local paper called the Scarborough Leader that got delivered to their mailbox each week. And so as a superintendent, it was, my challenge was to diversify our communication and decide how to best reach all members of the community and having different approaches. Of course, if you're tweeting something out, what you're going to say looks really different if you're sending, putting an article in the local newspaper. So I like to diversify my communication and tailor it to what works best for the community.
Great, thank you so much. Our next question comes from Melrose Public School parent Sarah Bezagai, and she asks a very pertinent question to the current times we find ourselves in. With many of us thrown into homeschooling this week and for the foreseeable future, it's obvious to me, she writes, how essential creativity and the arts are in learning, both visual, dramatic arts, as well as music, technology, movement, and STEAM. Kids learn by doing. Art is a universal language and vehicle for exploration. Do you believe in the power of the creative arts in learning? And if so, how would you implement that across the curriculum in Melrose?
Great question. So first, thank you for what you're doing to educate your children at home. I also have a 6-year-old at home, and I understand this new world that we're all settling into. And I know that it's not easy. And so the first thing I would say is just a little unsolicited advice. Just know that you're doing a good job. Set little goals every day and breathe. You got this. In terms of my views about the arts, I think that they are extremely important. I have been an advocate for arts in school across all of my experiences. It's oftentimes one of those easy targets when there's tough budget times to think about reducing, and I have made it a point to advocate in the exact opposite. Also, as superintendent, I like to be present at visual and performing arts events, again, to show my support to those educators, but also to reinforce the value that it adds to teaching and learning across the grades and across the content areas. As a district who's focused on personalized learning, I think that Melrose is positioned really well to be integrating the arts across the content areas. And I'm guessing that if I have the opportunity to get into classrooms, I'll see lots of evidence of that. And so it may be a matter of us just communicating out exactly how that's already happening in our schools, and or thinking about strategic ways to make new investments and channel resources to further amplify that. We know that all students learn differently, and for some students, learning through whether it be performing arts or visual arts or some other type of fine art activity can really help them make long-lasting connections and allow them to build that schema that they'll need later on to build new knowledge from.
Great, thank you so much. We actually have 2 related questions around supporting LGBTQ students, and so I think I'll read them both, and then you can sort of take them in any order or however you want. So the first is that has to do with the middle school and high school level, and then the other question actually has to do with supporting LGBTQ students at the K-5 level. So let me read them both. They're from 2 parents, Tracy Cruikshank and Kitty Flynn. And the first question is, Melrose has an active gay-straight alliance at the high school and middle school level, as well as a parent support group in the community. It's called EPIC. What support do you anticipate offering in terms of training for teachers, staff, and volunteers in our district to support the LGBTQ student population? And then the second part, as I mentioned, is what is your experience with LGBTQ students in the K-5 level and how to best support them?
Sure. Thank you, Tracy and Kitty, for your questions. First, I think it starts with modeling. I believe that it's important for every superintendent, every school leader to model what it means to truly be safe and inclusive in every setting of our schools. And so if you were to come to my office today, you would see right outside my door, I have a safe space sticker on my door, and I am proud to open my door and welcome all to come in and share their stories with me. when I transitioned to Scarborough, one of my first interactions with students was learning from a student who was struggling to fit into the culture and climate based on his own sexual orientation, and in fact was requesting to be placed outside of the district. From that, hearing his story, hearing of his experiences, and also the experiences that he was suggesting that we engage staff in and students in order to create a safer space for all students, really enlightened me and opened the door to many conversations. So with that knowledge in mind, I then started talking with other students about their experiences and the role that the culture and the climate was playing in their education. One of the things that came out of those many conversations was that myself, along with several other students at the high school, created an equity improvement network. And through that equity improvement network, the students really took the lead. They created a website. They created a list of resources for staff, including a library, a social justice library that was categorized by grade level. They also led some professional development for the leadership team. So they would create these little mini lessons, if you will. For example, one was about microaggressions. Another was about gender identity and fluidity. And they would educate the principals and the directors in the district about what they thought they could be doing, or little simple things that teachers could be doing. One example that came from the students was like on the first day of class, instead of reading off students' names, you could simply just say their last name and ask how they preferred to identify. Another example that came from the students was creating, when you create name tags, also having stickers with pronoun preferences, so that whether it was adults or students could then publicly start to share what their preferred pronouns were, making it more of a norm and decreasing the stigma around having preferences. Myself, if you were to get an email from me today, you would see that I too list my preferred pronouns at the bottom of my email. Just another small way of modeling and signaling that all people are welcome and safe here.
Great, thank you.
I could give a few other examples as well, but maybe we can circle back if there's more time.
Okay, great. No, we have plenty of time. And the next question is from a community partner that's very important to the Melrose Public Schools, and it's Rebecca Mooney, who's the executive director of the Melrose Alliance Against Violence. And Rebecca asks, what is your experience and approach to preventing bullying, sexual harassment, and teen dating violence?
Sure. One of the things that we launched during my first year as superintendent in Scarborough was a Reducing Sexism and Violence program in partnership with Maine Boys to Men. So when we started that program, we wanted to be really thoughtful about the rollout and start small, with the idea that the goal over time was to scale it up. And so we met with leadership. There were 2 teachers from the high school who volunteered, if you will, to be a part of the programming. One of them I know is still involved with the program and is really a huge attribute to its success and longevity in the district. But our goal was at first to think about, how do we help all of our 8th grade students have sort of like a baseline experience or education around what healthy masculinity looks like? And that was in partnership with Maine Boys to Men. So they would come in and work directly with all male identifying students in the 8th grade for 12 total hours over a series of different smaller chunks of time and trainings. And then we partnered with Hardy Girls, Healthy Women to ensure that our female identifying students had sort of an equivalent, not exact experience, but something, again, helping them think about healthy body images and consent and what safe, healthy relationships look like. Then when we got to the high school, at the same time, we had the teachers helped us identify 40 students, 20 male identifying and 20 female identifying students who were either known influencers, maybe had the potential to be an influencer, but maybe yet hadn't had the opportunity to display that leadership, and other students who we felt like would be connected to the work or passionate about the work. And so we started small with those 40 students. It was 2 days, 12 hours, 6 hours each day, back to back, and they would come to town hall, and Maine Boys to Men really facilitated that work and led them through a variety of exercises that were really emotional and really honest. The students who participated, there was a mixed reaction initially. Even some asked for students to not continue in the training because it was too emotional, or it felt like male-identifying male students were being portrayed as perpetrators when they talked about what healthy masculinity was. But we decided to stay the course and to continue the conversation. And by the time that I left Scarborough in year 3, I believe they were training upwards of 120 high school students a year. The students themselves ended up creating a service club where they would design other activities and events to take place and really own the leadership of that work. And it also started creating a safer space for our GSA to be communicating about their experiences in the schools. And so I'm thinking of one faculty meeting in particular where students stood up and spoke really honestly about their own experiences. It was very hard to hear some of what they had experienced, but necessary to hear in order for us to really understand what was actually happening with our kids. Part of our goal was also that our students that we were sending off to college, so our seniors, would have some specific training and workshop opportunity around consent before they graduated in year 1, and then over time that just became part of the programming.
Thank you. Our next question is from Melrose High School parent Sheila Gouch, and she asks, Melrose educators are trained in restorative practices to support students. Could you share your thoughts and experiences with restorative practices, and how will you support furthering education and understanding of this practice with teachers, students, and also caregivers?
Sure. So I have a lot of experience with restorative circles at teacher to student level, student to administrator, student to student, all the way up through even facilitating some staff to staff restorative circles. I believe that they are important. I believe that the intent behind restorative circles is to allow for the relationship to heal, which I think is so important, particularly when there's times in our society that it seems like we're surrounded by a lot of hate. I think creating an avenue and modeling for students and staff how we can rebuild and establish relationships, even when we've experienced some sort of trauma or maybe altercation, if you will, there's still a pathway forward if we're willing to come to the conversation and be honest about what we were feeling, but also be empathetic about what the other person might have been feeling. I think it's a great way to help students develop that empathy and compassion. In my experience, what I've learned, however, is that in order for that conversation to be successful, both people have to come to the conversation willing to repair the relationship. And so I believe that there's some pre-work that's essential with each individual prior to bringing them together and facilitating that restorative conversation.
Thank you. So we have a couple of questions on the same topic here, and it's around this idea of what we call here in this district, it goes by other names elsewhere, I think, unleveling classes. Mm-hmm. And you may know that the school committee recently voted to unlevel classes and teach the honors curriculum to all students in the 9th grade in certain subject areas for next year. And so there are a couple questions around that. I'm going to read them because I do think it's fair to understand that some people don't agree with that, and that's, I think, I want to make sure I capture that if
Sure.
That's why they're writing in.
Sure.
So I'll read them both, and then you can sort of take them as a group. So the first one comes from a parent, Kristen Moran, and she writes, in light of the recent cuts to the honors program for rising 9th graders, now I just want to be clear that some people wouldn't characterize it that way, including myself, how will you restore or otherwise address keeping our gifted student population engaged and challenged? And related from another high school parent, Jerry Melrose, there is much talk about personalized learning, while ignoring that different children have different levels of academic learning readiness? How do you differentiate actual equity and opportunity for children so that they're instructed with content appropriate to their prior achievement and readiness to learn, from the simplistic notion that equity somehow requires that all children of the same age but with widely varying learning readiness be placed in the same unleveled classrooms, in which teachers can't possibly teach effectively to all levels?
Sure.
I know there's a lot there. I can repeat any of it, but I think you understand what the questions are driving at.
Yeah, so I first would say that there's lots of evidence that supports unleveling and supports giving students an opportunity to be able to have agency in their own learning. I believe that's the goal of personalized learning, at least in my definition of it. I think that the other thing that can happen is that we sort of tell kids that they fit into one track or one pathway, and that can be limiting if we're sending that message too strongly. So I would want to make sure that as we're making this transition, we're really helping students understand and teachers understand how they can truly differentiate their learning experience and or instruction. And I think it goes both ways, particularly as our students get older. You know, if they're able to develop that agency for themselves and advocacy for themselves, there's ways for them to seek enrichment and or remediation within, you know, an unleveled pathway, from my experience. And so when we're thinking about the gifted student, I think it's the same question we have to ask for all students every day, every course, all the time. What is Julie doing well? What is she ready to learn? And making sure that our curriculum isn't just a prepackaged one-size-fits-all delivery style, which I'm not suggesting that it is, but then even as teachers are preparing lessons in units of study, really thinking about, okay, so how am I going to differentiate? Even though we might have a common goal or a common learning target, there's still ways for me to either differentiate the content, the process in which students engage with the content, or the product. What is it that we're expecting? And so I believe that students can be in the same class, receiving the same type of instruction, if you will, or mini lesson, but that we can differentiate in other ways. So they might have different leveled reading materials about the same topic, or they might be, some might be asked to write, you know, a literary essay with XYZ expectations, where another student might be asked to do like an oral defense. So I think there's lots of ways for teachers to differentiate, even if you have mixed abilities and mixed levels within the same classroom. And from my experience, I have found that when you create those opportunities for kids, there's a lot of other positive side effects, if you will, that come from that type of treatment of teaching and learning.
Thank you. So we have a question about special education. Could you please discuss your vision for special education in Melrose if you are our next superintendent? And I should have mentioned that this question came from Carolyn Ormond, who's a Melrose High School parent.
Thank you for the question, Carolyn. So I believe deeply, as part of my core values, that all students should be fully included in the least restrictive, most important learning, or most appropriate learning environment. With that being said, I also believe that all students should be able to receive, whenever possible, their educational program within their home district. And so that means we have to allocate the resources necessary in order to design the program if it doesn't yet exist, or locate the program if we're not able to do that. In the perfect scenario, you're able to create that program here in the district, but we have the same obligation either way to either create or locate. Those are really the only two choices when it comes to meeting the needs of all students. But if we're looking at it from a fiscal responsibility standpoint, most of the time, with some exceptions, it's more cost effective to build the program right here in our district, and there's benefits to all when we're able to do that.
Thank you. So the next question comes from elementary and middle school parent, Karen Blackburn, and she asks, what do you see, based on what you've learned so far, as the biggest opportunity and the biggest challenge facing Melrose?
So that's the question I've been asking today as I had a chance to engage with administrators and also some teachers. What I'm hearing from our staff is that, or the staff here in Melrose, is that the biggest success, if you will, are the people. That there's a lot of commitment to the Melrose Public Schools. One administrator shared that she herself went to school here and that she's not alone and that many others also have gone to school here and then come back to work in a variety of ways. So I think that's a great success when we have a collective community, not just a school system, that our children grow up through and then say when it's time for them to enter into adulthood, settle down, start their families, they want to come back and give back to their community and live in the community where they were raised. So I don't think that can be understated. That to me is an amazing success. One of the opportunities I'm learning about is building on the already effective professional development that exists in the district to really hear from the teachers directly what it is that they are feeling they need at this time to better serve the changing population in Melrose. So whether that's looking at our English language learners or our special education population or our general education population, really across the board with all kids and saying, what is it, just like we do with our kids, and we say, what do they know? What are they ready to learn? We need to ask that same question of our staff. What skills do they have? What skills do they need so that they can feel efficacious in their work and that they're feeling supported in their work? So that seems to be an opportunity based on what I'm hearing so far. But of course, I would imagine this would become more clear with more conversations over time through the entry plan process.
Thank you. Our next question is from Rebecca Interbartolo, who is a Melrose Public School parent and also leader in our community's recycling efforts, and runs a very, very comprehensive recycling program at one of our elementary schools, the Roosevelt School. And she asks, we are currently in a global climate crisis. What steps would you take to make our schools more sustainable?
Thank you for your question, Rebecca. So I think that it takes the whole community to really change behaviors and change habits. And in my current experience, we're having a similar challenge. Cost of recycling are going up, cost of trash pickup is going up, so there's lots of questions from elected officials in my current community about what are the schools doing, what's our part. So one of the things that I did was get together with our director of facilities, our director of information technology, our food service director, and our K-12 health and wellness teacher to start to think about what are some of the ways that we can be composting, recycling, and managing our waste in a more efficient, environmentally responsible way. And what we decided to do was form a committee that consists of several students who are a part of the environmental club and also a student from the National Honor Society. And we've developed a mission, we've developed a 3-year strategic plan. We're creating a logo as we speak, but our name is HW Goes Green. And already, just since we started meeting, we've had 3 or 4 meetings so far. We have more ideas than probably capacity at the moment to actually effectively implement. But some of the things we've already done was change out some older refillable stations. So students were bringing in their hydro flasks and other types of reusable bottles, but then buying like 3 and 4 waters from the cafeteria to fill their bottle because they didn't feel comfortable using the water. The refillable station, it was like rusty and dingy looking. So we replaced that like within a couple of weeks and did a big kind of like reopening of the fillable station in the cafeteria, which got people thinking about the work that we're doing and also helped our students see that their voice matters and we're willing to act. We're also really trying to empower them to be the leaders because we know they are the ones who are going to change the way we do business around recycling and trash and waste in general. So one of our goals is to become a zero waste facility. We're still setting our benchmark date for that, but it's really been exciting to work with them. A couple of other things that we've done in a really short time was just assess our consumption. So we started pulling data to see how much waste are we using. A student, in partnership with a parent, created a survey that's going to go out to students at some point in the near future. We also are looking at our big launch with the 2 towns because we're in a regional district. Our original plan was for that to be around Earth Day this year, which is also when we were scheduled to have our town meeting. Of course, like many of these things will be postponed and rescheduled. But we're looking at maximizing things like the child care that we provide during town meeting to include different activities to educate younger students around more sustainable practices and how they can make a difference. Because, as Greta says, activism is real. And so really riding on the energy of the students, they have been so amazing. They also asked that the cafeterias stop serving plastic water bottles, so we've been piloting cardboard compostable boxed water for students who may not have a refillable water bottle. So there's several really exciting things that they've done so far. One more, just because I'm so proud of the work that they did, that they're doing. They worked with our director of facilities to reassess the way our trash and recycle was being picked up, because although we had recycle bins in every classroom, it was all going into the garbage. And so we now have a new system. We renegotiated our contract with our waste management company. So we're getting ready to launch that and really actually be recycling for real soon.
That's great. Thank you so much. Those are really awesome examples. So the next question is from elementary school parent Geraldine O'Leary. And her question is, do you have any experience with redistricting within a school district? If so, can you please elaborate on the process and the criteria used?
So I do have some experience. I started my career in New Jersey in a public school on the McGuire Air Force Base. And although it was a public school, about 76% of our population were military dependents. We had 5 schools on base and maybe 4 schools on base and 1 school that was the civilian school in the community. So as you could imagine, just having that geographical boundary created sort of 2 separate communities within one community. And then we were fortunate enough to have a new building project where all the kids came together at grades 5 and 6. But yet, in a lot of ways, there was still that cultural divide, even though they were now in the same building. So we started thinking about, what were some of the other systemic changes that we could make in order to create a more shared sense of community. We had a little help with that when the base started a whole new housing project, and so it really opened up because the Air Force Base was right next to Fort Dix, which was an Army base, and they became a joint base. So that in and of itself caused us to have to shift the way we were sort of normally drawing boundaries. But we used all of that change as an opportunity for us to think about, why do we separate? And I should also add that they came together on the base for pre-K and kindergarten, and then separated at 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th grade, because we were pre-K to 6 and sent to a regional middle school. And that was just sort of what we had always done. So that we started rethinking that, and now they've grown even so much further down that road. There's a brand new, beautiful school on the base where all students come together. So that's my experience in terms of redistricting, but in a really different type of context.
Thank you. So following up on the topic of differentiation and meeting the needs of all learners in a classroom, this question comes from Lisa Lewis, who is a middle school and high school parent. And she asks, following up on differentiation, how will you support educators with differentiation at all levels? What will you do to make sure it is happening in our classrooms? And can you point to specific examples from your past work?
Sure. So I think first I would want to understand what we are doing, what learning opportunities have been created for all staff, and what are our expectations in terms of differentiation. And so for me, the way I've looked at this in the past and the way I've worked with staff as a principal, as a director of curriculum, and as a superintendent in the past is to start by looking at our multi-tiered support system and really getting clear about what is Tier 1 instruction. So, for those of you who know what I'm talking about, I'm thinking about a pyramid where the biggest slice at the bottom is that instruction that's for all students, and giving staff an opportunity to think about all the strategies, all the tools that they have to really meet the needs of all learners right there in their home classroom, if you will, through Tier 1 instruction. And what I found in doing that with different types of teams and different staffs is that in and of itself can be a really big learning experience, because teachers do a lot of this naturally, but they might not be naming it as differentiation. So that's a chance to be affirmed that you already have a lot of these skills, you already do a lot of these things naturally, so let's notice that and let's name that. And in one district where we were doing this work, we also were implementing instructional coaches at that time. So we utilized the power of the instructional coach and that job-embedded, just-in-time professional development to help folks notice and name what they were doing, but then also see opportunities where they could be differentiating more. Also working through like a student support team to say, here's this learner, I've done X, Y, and Z, I've tried all of these things to meet their needs and I'm still struggling, to be able to hear from a colleague some other ideas that you could bring back to your classroom and try the very next day has been some really powerful and meaningful learning opportunities as well. And one of the things that we did in those student support teams was not just to say, like, here's a new strategy to try, but then we would assign a colleague who would be kind of a support. So, Julie's going to try this new strategy. We think it'll work for this student. Who's going to help? Who's going to check in with her in 2 weeks, or who can help her think about that a little more deeply after the meeting, and making sure that they had, a trusted colleague to share their thinking with and test their ideas on, but then also be able to say, like, I tried that and it didn't work. What should I do next? Sometimes you just need a critical friend to have a conversation with as you're trying out new things.
Thank you. So we have a couple questions around the topic of homework, and I'll summarize and say that I guess, what do you feel that homework should be assigned at the elementary school level, and if so, how much?
So I worry about our kids a lot. I see even our youngest learners in multiple districts. I don't know if this is true here yet, but I would imagine that it is. Our young people are under a great deal of stress. We have really high expectations for them, as we should, but sometimes I wonder if we're giving them enough time to just relax and unwind. Recently, I was reading something about like screen time during downtime isn't really downtime, because your brain thinks you're still working, so you're not actually getting to rest and recover from that work day. And so I think about homework kind of in that way, particularly for our young learners, and particularly when we know that they have lots of enrichment activities that they're also being scheduled into outside of the day. Most of us, educators probably not included in this conversation, but I think that we need to let the workday end at the workday and find some balance, and I think that's true for adults as well. So I worry about the amounts of homework that some students are getting. I would want to understand, what are we assigning here? What does it look like at each grade level? Is it age appropriate? I'd have a lot more questions about that, but a couple of things that I think I wish our students did only have to focus on would be reading every day. We know that it's such a gift for students to have a love of reading. And so what if we dialed it back a little bit, and I'm not saying this about Melrose necessarily, but just as a field, and kind of tethered the expectations so that it was more manageable. I know in some situations for families, homework becomes a battle, and I worry about the impact that has on family time. And we get so little of it, it feels like these days. So how could we maybe tether those expectations and just put some other priorities in perspective? So I'd want to have that conversation for sure.
Thank you. And that's maybe embedded in there some good advice for all of us this week, and next week, and the week after. So this is another question along the lines of balance, but a little bit of a different take, which is, could you please discuss your vision and goals for the Melrose Visual and Performing Arts program, including how you will ensure or maybe investigate whether there is equity between athletics and the arts at Melrose High School? It seems like both compete for space at Melrose High School and for funding.
So I don't yet have a vision or goals. I think first I would want to learn what's happening. And I don't mean to keep saying that, but I don't want you to think that I'm coming in with some prepackaged, pre-prescribed plan. I don't think that works in transition. I do think we need to give ourselves permission to take a step back and allow the learning process to occur of a new superintendent coming in. So I would want to talk with students, both athletes and those in the visual and performing arts, and hear from them. What's their perspective? I would want to hear from parents. I would want to hear from teachers. I would want to look at the budget and, assess, do we have equitable funding? What are the competing priorities? And are there ways for us to find a better balance, in ensuring that both get equal light, if you will, equal time in the spotlight? I think they're both critically important. We know, like, the research is really, really clear that students who are involved in extracurricular activities are like 75% more likely to go on to post-secondary learning opportunities than students who are intermittently involved. And I think that the number increases up to like 400% for kids who are not involved at all. So I would want to help the Melrose Public Schools think about, how do we create a space for all students to engage in some type of extracurricular activity, whether it be a service club, visual or performing arts, athletics, or some other type of club, just so that they're having that connection. Because when you really start to dig into that research, it isn't just about access to post-secondary. Students who are involved in extracurricular activities regularly have better life outcomes and better health outcomes, better job attainment, healthier relationships. And when they hold a leadership role, those numbers are amplified. So I think that's really important information to keep in mind when we're thinking about our priorities and our budgeting, but also in our scheduling and our communication as well.
Thank you. So for those watching at home, thank you for sending in questions. I would encourage you to continue to do so throughout our time together at the URL on the screen. It's not too late to get your question answered. We actually have a question that came in from a student.
Awesome.
And I'm just going to use, the student identified as a 5th grader, and I'm just going to say his first name, which is Justin. And it relates to an earlier question where you talked about screens. Mm-hmm. How much time do you think elementary and middle school kids should spend on Chromebooks during the school day? How would you encourage teachers to use other methods of learning instead of using screens?
Justin, that's a great question. I would want us to be really mindful of what we're learning from the science fields. We are learning more and more every day about brain development and the role that screens are playing. I do think that I was just hearing a story the other day that was saying maybe screen time isn't as bad as we thought. I didn't get to catch the whole story on NPR, but I'm curious to go back and read that. I think about this a lot, particularly right now as we're all home trying to figure out how to continue the learning process in a distant way, and technology being a big vehicle for that. In terms of the traditional school day where you're here, I would want you using technology in 2 ways. One way is to be consuming some information, so you're doing research and you're gathering data, or you're looking into a problem that you want to solve, or better yet, you're thinking of a problem that is, that needs to be solved. And then the other way is, so that's consumption in my mind. And then the other way is production. Like, you're actually creating something. You're actually designing something. to me, that's valuable screen time. So I guess my answer is that all screen time's not created equal. I would be interested to know what you're doing on the Chromebooks during that screen time, and then putting it in balance and knowing that the likelihood of you having additional screen time when you go home is high. So how do we kind of create, it's like having a healthy diet. You need a healthy screen time diet. Broccoli's good, but you can only eat broccoli. And ice cream's delicious, but we can only eat ice cream. So how do we do a little bit of both and decide when we're using technology, what's the why behind it? And is it really necessary? Or is it just like replacing the pencil and paper that we used to use? And making smarter choices based on that.
Thank you. So this is a question that I think I'll just give you a little bit of context, because it is, to your earlier point, it's sort of a specific Melrose thing, and we all understand that you have not dug into every Melrose-related issue, but I do think it's important to bring up because it's really related, I think, to making decisions in a leadership role that might be unpopular. And the context for you is that for many, many years, Melrose sent students to environmental camp, or e-camp, at the end of their 5th grade year, sort of marking the end of their elementary school journey here. And the school administration canceled the program last year, even though, as this questioner writes, it was extremely popular among families, students, and some staff. A group of parents outside of the district organized the trip for this year for the 5th graders. And the question is, would you be willing to work with families to look at reinstating the program for next year through the district? I might expand that to say, how would you communicate with families around unpopular decisions, with this being one example?
Sure. So this is the tricky thing about being a superintendent. I always say, like, you don't do this job to collect friends. And it's hard to make decisions that are going to please everybody. To the specific question, I would want to understand, what was the why behind the decision? What led up to the decision? Was there an equity issue? Was there some health risk or some other challenge that led to that decision? To speak specifically to that. But unpopular decisions in general, I think it's really important that, and this is where, all of my leadership experience comes into play, really understanding, what are the political points, what are the interpersonal points. Traditions are hard. Like, we love our traditions, right? And for many families, they probably have been talking about something like this capstone trip for years leading up to this student's now in 5th grade and it's not there. So we have to understand the loss that families feel when we change traditions. I think it's best when we replace that loss with something new and better when we can. So hopefully that's happening, if possible. But then it's about listening and really engaging the community. And then when the decision is made, helping them understand why the decision was made, and what the rationale was. Because otherwise, if we're not telling the story, other people will tell the story for us, and it might not always be accurate.
Thank you. So the next question is about middle school students, and in particular about your experience with, here in Melrose we have the middle school team model. Your experience with that model, and why you think it's important if you do. What do you think it brings to the middle school experience?
So I think middle school is a unique point in adolescent development. I appreciate the team model. In my current district, they have a team model, and all of the feedback I've heard from the teachers and the principals is that it works really well, and the students are really supported with that type of model. Again, it's hard to generalize because it all depends on how it's being implemented. And what we mean when we say team model, because a lot of times in education we use this seemingly common vocabulary, but once you start to ask questions you realize that there might be a varying definition or interpretation of what a team model is. But generally, I do think that middle school needs to look different than elementary school and different than high school. And so a team model can be really successful when implemented well and when you're able to financially support it, because typically it does require additional resources.
Great. So this question is from Carolyn Ormond, again, is a Melrose High School parent. What would you want to accomplish during your first 6 months as superintendent in Melrose?
So in my first 6 months, I would like to interact with as many people as possible, and that would happen in a variety of ways, one-on-one conversations, both internally and externally. So really getting to know the leadership team first and foremost as the folks I will work directly with most daily, getting to know our teachers, getting in our schools, being able to see our kids actively learning within the classroom and around the classroom. Also talking with parents, elected officials, making connections with different social groups in town and service groups in town. Of course, working with the school committee and the mayor as part of that and building that relationship. So the point of the whole listening, learning phase of the entry plan in my mind is really to begin to establish relationships so that very quickly you can have a level of trust and credibility with the stakeholders at all levels. There are things that will happen within the entry that are very, kind of technical. The budget process will happen within the first 6 months. We start that early typically. And so before we're coming out and making big asks in terms of our school budget in support of that, we need to have those relationships. So the first 6 months is really about relationships, learning as much as I can, using surveys, using small group forums, meeting people where they are, going to, the different parent organization groups, and really preparing for some of the bigger conversations that will come down the way. And at the end of that 6 months, December, January timeframe, I should really be synthesizing all of that data and reporting back to the community what I've learned during that time, knowing that the learning doesn't stop just because I'm giving you a report, but knowing that folks will be very curious about what are the emerging themes, what are our strengths, what are the opportunities, and how do we go about addressing those. So the first 6 months is really information gathering and relationship building.
Great, thank you. So the next question comes from Ann Severson, who is a Melrose parent. Would you tell us about your own teaching experience and how that informs both your understanding of the classroom and your work as an administrator?
Sure. So I had the pleasure of teaching kindergarten, first grade, and third grade. So all of my direct teaching experience has been in the elementary grades. And when I was offered my first job, the principal called me and said, "I have a first grade position for you, but you have to teach inclusion." And I said, "Great, I'll do it." And then I hung up the phone and I was like, "What's inclusion?" I did not have a special ed background at the time, but I very quickly learned what inclusion was about, the why behind it, what good inclusion, effective inclusion looked like, what ineffective inclusion looked like. And I'm really grateful for that experience at the beginning of my career because it really helped me think about how do you truly differentiate instruction, what does it mean to meet the needs of all learners, and how do I partner with my colleagues in order to do that really well. So that was the beginning of my career. And then after 3 years of being a principal, I transitioned from first grade to third grade later on, became a principal, a vice principal, then principal of the building in which I started teaching. So that was interesting as well to become the leader of folks who were and still are my mentors in the same building where I started teaching. And after 3 years, during that reorganization of the base that I talked about earlier, we closed a school, and I was the least tenured principal. So I went back into the classroom and taught kindergarten, which was a huge, huge learning curve after being an administrator for 3 years. But I am so grateful for that experience because I learned how to really break down information. I'll share an anecdote. I remember early on in the first few days, we were fortunate to have full-time teaching assistants in our classroom, and she had like 25 years of experience. So I was, helping the students do this like baseline assessment, and they had to circle pictures of things. And so I was like, okay, with your red crayon, circle the cat or whatever it was. And she sort of like raised her hand from the back, and she was like, they don't know what red is. And I was like, they don't? So I was like, everybody hold up your red crayon. And it was like a rainbow in the room. And so I was like, okay, this red crayon. So everybody got their red crayon. And then I was like, circle the cat. And she was like, they don't know what a circle is. I don't know if that would be true for kindergartners today, but that moment always sticks out in my mind, and helps me remember not to assume anything, and to realize that even if you think someone should know something, taking the time to just check in before you go too far is always a good strategy. And all things I learned from those kindergartners still serves me well to this day in my role as a superintendent.
Thank you. Our next question is from Dr. Michael David Miner, and he asks, the world is always changing, and we need to prepare our students for a dynamic professional life. How would you ask teachers to push their students to encourage the highest levels of developmental growth?
So I think one strategy toward that end is teaching students how to set goals, both short-term and long-term, and then coaching them along the way. If they learn at a very young age how to kind of assess their priorities, put things in perspective, set those goals, and then take strategic actions towards meeting those goals, that's transferable to anything that you want to do personally or professionally. And along with that comes a lot of other skills that, in education we often call 21st century skills, but they're really those adaptive skills that we know every employer is looking for. And that includes being flexible and agile, being a clear and effective communicator, having empathy, being a good steward of our environment, along with many others. So I think that, first things first is like, let's teach them some transferable skills that will last them a lifetime.
Thank you. This is a question from a parent soon to be entering the Melrose Public Schools, Finn McSweeney, and he asks, our first child enters kindergarten in the fall. What's the number one thing you wish all first-time public school parents knew?
Well, having been in your shoes just a few months ago, Finn, I think I would want you to understand what a big transition it is for your child. And I thought I understood this being a public educator, but what I realized was that all of those connections that my daughter had made in preschool and all of the connections she had made to her teachers in preschool, she would really be missing when she transitioned to kindergarten in her new school. And I wasn't really prepared for that, or I guess realizing how important that would be to her in her own social and emotional development. So spending time talking about, what's going to feel new and different, but how do you hold on and cherish some of those previous experiences, I think are really important. And then staying connected with your teacher. They are your number one ally. You want to be really connected with them. When you have a question, don't wait. Make sure you ask. And the third thing I would say is remember that you are your child's advocate. That is your job. So if ever you feel like your child's not getting what they need, don't wait. Talk to your teachers about it, and never feel like you have to apologize for advocating for your child.
Thank you. We're having connectivity challenges. Thanks, everybody. We're moving to a different machine here.
Okay.
So the next question is, one of our biggest challenges in the coming years is our growing student population and limited building space, as you've previously referred to a little bit. Do you have experience addressing this particular type of challenge? And I think I might also add, harkening back to the earlier conversation, what criteria would you look at for placement?
Sure. So the first thing I would want to do is really assess what space we have, what space is available. I know that there's the possibility or the inevitability that the BB school will come back online. I don't think that's happening for this school year. But I would want to look at that space and see how is it designed, how can we maximize our existing space, and align our programming so that the space, the environmental, the learning environment matches the programmatic needs. And that's hard when you have older buildings and you're trying to kind of retrofit modern education into those spaces. In the meantime, we need to start talking with the community about the challenges and how it's affecting our programming or limiting our ability to meet student needs, if that's the case. In my current district, that's very much the case. We have 3 very old elementary schools. One of the schools houses most of our intensive learning programs because the other 2 schools aren't fully ADA compliant. So that's an issue. And we've been just at every opportunity trying to communicate, what our space allows us to do, but also what we're not able to do in that space. One of the very first things I did in transitioning to Hamilton-Wenham after my own visits to each of the schools was bring the school committee into all of the schools, make sure that they have seen the condition of the buildings, and learn from the principals directly what works about this space and where the challenges are. I also brought the town manager and the town administrator from both towns through the space so they too could see with their own eyes the same limitations. The district had already been working through MSBA and had submitted statements of interest the last 2 years. We had one in process, so we were just waiting to find out if we qualified, if we were invited into the program pipeline. We were not this year, but we know that, we got like extra consideration, if you will. And so we then went back and kind of re-strategized and said, okay, well, what if we include all 3 elementary schools? Does that make our package more enticing or more viable? We also, in our capital budget this year, have requested funding to do an educational plan so we can engage the community in understanding their perspectives on the schools. If a new school were to come to fruition, would it be a consolidated school? Would it be, renovating our existing schools? There's lots of possibilities, but we need to start those conversations with the community so that if and when we're invited into the pipeline, we know that they have our backs and they're on board. Again, we're hoping that will make us more viable for a project in the near future. Meanwhile, we're trying to, do the best we can with what we have. So that's my most recent experience. I've had other experiences in other districts as well, which I'm happy to go into detail if there's more questions.
Thank you. As you alluded to earlier, you have previously worked as an educator on an Air Force base,
Yeah.
and this question says, thank you for your past service to our military families and students. This is a unique perspective. Is there a lesson or 2 from that experience that you bring to your approach in education and leadership?
The military is our military families have amazing community. And what was fascinating to me was how quickly they formed bonds and how long lasting those bonds became. So if ever there was a family where one of the spouse, or in some cases both spouses, would be deployed at the same time, the way the community came to help was just so amazing to me, and it really made clear to me the power of community and how important it is that all of our kids are all of our kids all the time. One of the other things along that same line was that at this point, in the late 90s or in the early 2000s when I was there, our military families, some of the active duty folks were still having 2-year terms. And so it was a lot of transition. They could be moved around depending on what rank they were in the military every 2 years. So being able to welcome those families and help them make connections and feel part of the community on day one was really essential so that they could remain whole in transitions. Later on, the military did start to spread out some of the higher ranking stations to 4 years. So families weren't moving as much, but there were some years where the kids, when I was teaching, I might have 20 kids on day one, and by the end of the year, maybe only a handful of the kids were still there because there was so much transition. And so being able to think on my feet as an educator, being able to adapt, welcome students, meet them where they are, and help them make connections was essential.
Thank you.
Sure. And I believe that applies to all families in all districts. It was oxygen in that community.
Thanks. So the next question is from elementary school parent Mary Sparks, and I like the wording of this question. She says, We are fortunate to have a lot of rock star teachers, but how will you encourage all teachers to continue improving? Also, how will you support struggling teachers?
So I talked a little bit about this in the screening interview. I'm really fascinated in the research around career phases and differentiating support for professionals based on where they are in their career phase. And so I think that depending if you're if you're like a new teacher, 0 to 3, we do a really great job typically in education of partnering them with mentors and giving them lots of professional development. But then oftentimes, and I'm not saying that this is true here, but oftentimes in my experience, it doesn't look the same as we move throughout. We do kind of like whole district professional development or maybe some team or content specific professional development. But one of the things I think would help all educators continue to grow and feel efficacious in their work is to really customize what we're offering them based on where they are in their career phase. And then also really knowing our teachers and knowing what their aspirations are. Is there someone who aspires to be a principal? Could we give them more leadership opportunities within the district so that they're growing and feeling satisfied where they are? And if a teacher is struggling, really understanding and taking the time to listen and say, what is it that we can do to help? What kind of support do you need? And I'll give a specific example of a teacher that I worked with who was amazing when she was able to be in the district and when she was on. But there were times when she wasn't able to be for a variety of reasons. And so that then created gaps in their knowledge and their skill set in order to implement new curricular tools and meet student needs in the way that their colleagues were. And so being able to recognize that and provide one-on-one support, get a sub for a day or two, and let that person work with one of our curriculum coaches has really allowed that person to have more success. And so I think the same way we think about our students as learners, we need to think about our adults as learners and differentiate how we support them.
Thank you. So you've worked in several states, as you mentioned, including as a superintendent in Maine. And this question is asking about if you could reflect on your experience in Maine and on that leadership experience, and looking back, would you have done anything differently in your role as superintendent in Scarborough?
Yes. I think anytime you transition away from a position, or even while you're in that position, as educators, we're constantly reflecting on decisions that we've made, on choices that we've made, and sort of rethinking what would I have done differently if I had a do-over. So in Scarborough, there's several examples that come to mind, but I think specifically, it would be thinking about all of the different initiatives that were going on at one time. So when I arrived in Scarborough, it was kind of implementation point for several really big transformational things. They had been working on changing start times for a number of years. They had been working on implementing a proficiency-based diploma that was driven by a mandate from the state level. They had been working on some culture and climate issues. There was like 5 new curriculum resources that were introduced across the grade levels within a very short period of time. And so it was very clear early on that teachers were overwhelmed. They had initiative fatigue. They had concerns about the culture and climate, so much so that the teachers union was ready to administer their own culture and climate survey. And when I learned about that in the fall, I partnered with the teachers union to look at that culture and climate survey and to think about ways that we could make sure that the questions were unbiased and make sure that we were getting information that not only would inform the union's position, but also inform district leadership so that we could better support staff. There was lots of conversation among teachers feeling like they didn't have enough voice in some of the decisions that were made, or that there were processes put in place that it was like the illusion of voice and choice, but they didn't feel like it was authentic. And so we worked on that survey together, and the plan was to implement the survey in the springtime of my first year. And when vetting it with the leadership team, they weren't ready. The leadership team themselves weren't ready for the survey to go out, even though we had used a third-party vendor and collaborated over time. And I think one of the biggest mistakes was it was myself as superintendent with the teachers, with the union president, working with this third-party vendor. And we really should have had more voices at the table so that everyone felt committed to the questions and felt like they had a voice and a part in creating the questions. And so because that didn't happen, because there was some pushback, we decided not to do it. And then things escalated really quickly once we voted to change start times. And we never got around to actually administering the culture and climate survey, which I think would have really informed where we were and what we needed to focus our energy on in the midst of a lot of really big change.
Thank you.
Sure.
So we had a couple of questions from two different parents about this idea of differentiation and meeting the needs of all learners, including those who may be ready for more at their grade level, as well as those who need additional support to master the grade level content. And we do have a couple more that have come in, so I want to ask this one because I think which is also from Jerry Melrose, a previous questioner, because I think it gives an example, and maybe we can talk about the specific example. Sure. So his question is, would you place a child who hasn't yet mastered 5th grade math in a 7th grade classroom? Conversely, would you place a student who hasn't already mastered 7th grade math in a 5th grade classroom? So I think the question is around how would you address students who are by their age in a certain grade, but maybe ready for more or not ready for that content?
So that's a great question. And I think part of the challenge is that we've created this graded system from day one, right? If you're born after a certain date, that means that you're ready for kindergarten. If you're born the day later, you got to wait a year. And so I think if we're really going to solve the right problem here, we have to look at it from a systemic lens and ask ourselves, does it really make sense to be graded? And by graded, I mean grouped by your birth date. Or does it make more sense for us to think about developmental readiness and students' progression through, a scope and sequence or a set of standards or clear learning targets that is really personalized and individualized? That would be, in my mind, the ideal setting. It's a massive undertaking to do that. And again, it touches back to some of those traditions that we were talking about earlier. Most of us, if we went to public school, had a graded experience. You were 1st grade, then 2nd grade, then 3rd grade. Unless you didn't meet certain expectations, then you were retained, which is a whole nother set of challenges for students and the public school system. So I think the question is less, would you place a student, in this other grade more, but rather it's, what's the student's developmental readiness? And I'll just give another example of conversations that I've had with parents and staff about this, thinking about, a student who comes into kindergarten who has a lot of academic and technical skill. Can they just skip 1st grade, or can they just skip kindergarten and go right into 1st grade? And I always caution against that because I think we have to look at the social emotional readiness of the child, not just the knowledge and skills that they have. A student can be reading on or way above grade level, but that doesn't mean that they have the social emotional skills to be with a whole nother group of peers who are more socially and emotionally developed. And I think that's probably easier to think about. It maybe is a little more blurred at the elementary, but when you start to get to high school and you think about students who either were born in September and just young enough that they meet the cutoff, but they're the youngest in their grade, but the implications that can have, because then all of their friends are ready for relationships before they are. All their friends are driving before they are. When it comes to sports, they might be less physically developed than some of their peers because, calendar-wise or developmentally-wise, they're much younger. So I think the right answer is, rather than looking at birth date to determine placement, if we could really truly look at where students are and what they're ready to do and learn, we would be better serving all students.
Great, thank you.
Knowing that that's a huge undertaking.
Right. Thank you. So I think we are wrapping up our questions that have come in. We have a really a good question that I think is really appropriate to end on. And I also want to give you a couple of minutes at the end to cover anything with us that we haven't talked about. I know that we'll be talking with you as a school committee as well. Sure. And so let me ask this one, and then we can have a few minutes to wrap up as well. And this is just really around the idea of fit, which is something we talk about in our school system a lot. What drew you to Melrose, which you talked about a little bit about at the beginning, but why do you think you're the right fit to be our next school leader?
Sure. Great question. It's probably a lot of what I would want to say in my closing statement as well. So what drew me to Melrose is the culture of the community and what I've learned from talking to other people who either grew up here or who have lived here and know people who live and work here. First and foremost, I want to be in a school system where they're committed to continuous improvement. Everything that I've learned about your district shows me that you are. You're doing a lot of really progressive things here in Melrose, things that no one made you do. There was no mandate that said you had to be doing these things, yet because there was evidence that supported that it was good for kids, and because you had bold, courageous leadership, you were able to make that happen. I believe that my experience from classroom teacher all the way up through the superintendency gives me a unique lens to be able to continue that work with you and help make sure that you're maintaining that momentum in transition, because I'm able to see those pressure points at each level and want to really be a part of doing big, bold, courageous work so long as we know that it's going to be good for kids, and am intrigued by all the challenges that come along with that in terms of securing the proper resources, engaging the community, supporting the staff, hearing from the students what's working for them, and then also looking at our own data to see how are we growing over time and making sure that we're constantly improving.
Thank you. And do you have anything else that you wanted to add that we didn't cover? I know that was kind of a comprehensive ending question, but.
The only thing I would want folks at home that are watching to know is that you have a lot of things to celebrate here in Melrose. I would love the opportunity to be able to listen to you each individually, to learn more about your perspectives and your experiences, and then find the way that I can adapt my leadership and adjust my style to best serve this community. I think that the multiple types of experiences that I've had across different states, as I said before, really does bring a unique perspective and allows me to really think about what are the systems and processes that we need to put in place so that everyone in the organization can feel really supported while we're doing big, challenging work and responding to the changing needs of the community. And I believe that I have the skills and the work ethic to support you in all of the change that you have coming down the road. So thank you for your time tonight, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Kukenberger. And thank you all for joining us on this third virtual community forum. We know that these are really trying days and weeks, and we know that you're balancing a lot in your personal lives and your professional lives. We really appreciate that you took the time to help us continue with Melrose's civic life. And as we make this really important decision, these community forums have been really important. And I'm really, really glad that so many of you took the time to watch and to send in your questions. I think we've had over 100 questions submitted across the 3 candidates, and that's just absolutely terrific. I also want to thank our friends at Melrose High School TV, Mr. D and his awesome crew, as well as our friends at MMTV, where this is being simulcast tonight, and you can continue to share these videos with your friends and neighbors as well. Good luck to everyone. And please tune back in about a half an hour at 7 for the school committee interview with Dr. Kukenberger. Thank you all.